Some people learned about Johnny Appleseed from Disney's Melody Time in 1948. Others know him from poems, songs, or childhood rhymes. Here comes Johnny Appleseed. Apple seeds are all he needs. Planting orchards on his way out west. Wears a pot upon his head. Beneath the trees he makes his bed. Folks say Johnny's apples are the best. In these depictions, Johnny Appleseed is a folksy frontier hero, a cheerful wanderer who roams the American West, planting apple seeds, making friends, and spreading goodwill wherever he goes. He's often portrayed as eccentric but harmless, driven purely by a love of nature and generosity. But what many people don't realize is that Johnny Appleseed wasn't just folklore. He was a real person. And while poems and rhymes capture pieces of his image, they don't tell the full story. The truth behind Johnny Appleseed is far more complex and far less Disney-fied than the version presented in 1948. For starters, Johnny Appleseed's real name wasn't Johnny Appleseed at all. It was John Chapman. And while it's true that Chapman spent much of his life planting apple trees across the frontier, his motivations weren't as innocent as the poems suggest. One popular rhyme asks, "Why did he do it? We do not know. He wished that apples might root and grow." But in reality, Johnny Appleseed knew exactly why he was doing it: money. Chapman's primary goal was to sell apple orchards to westward moving settlers during the 19th century as Americans poured west in search of land and opportunity. He planted orchards ahead of settlement, then sold the land once homesteaders arrived. And those apples weren't meant for pies, cobblers, or fresh eating. They were grown for one booming industry above all else: hard apple cider. In the 19th century, cider was safer than water, widely consumed, and extremely profitable. So while Johnny Appleseed wasn't quite the gentle folk hero of legend, the stories aren't entirely wrong either. He was eccentric, he was a nomad, and he truly did plant apples, more than 1,000 acres of them. This is the full story of Johnny Appleseed, his motivations, his unusual religious beliefs, and his sudden, surprising death. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the untold corners of both the natural world and the past. I'm ATI staff writer Kay Fraga, joined by fellow staff writer Austin Harvey. Today, we're discussing the truth behind the wildly mythologized story of Johnny Appleseed. Had you heard of Johnny Appleseed before?
Yeah, I definitely heard the name, even if I didn't know much about him. Funny enough, my girlfriend's dad came over with pizza last night, and out of nowhere, he started talking about Johnny Appleseed.
Randomly?
Totally random. We were talking about gardening, he had given us tomatoes, and then it turned into a conversation about how beer used to be essential to survival. Bread and beer were staples if you were poor. Then he brought up Johnny Appleseed owning land and selling it off, how clever he was.
And you were like, wow.
Yeah, I literally said, I'm doing a podcast about this tomorrow.
That's wild.
There's a word for that phenomenon, when you learn something new and suddenly see it everywhere. I can't remember the word, but yeah.
I didn't really know much about Johnny Appleseed either until editing this piece about a year ago, but let's get into the real history. John Chapman was born on September 26, 1774, just as the American colonies were moving toward revolution. His childhood was turbulent. His mother died when he was young, and his father remarried and had 10 more children. But the bigger influence on Chapman's life was timing. He came of age during massive national change, the American Revolution, the birth of the United States, and soon after, westward expansion. That expansion accelerated after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And surprisingly, apples played a major role in all of it. In 1792, the Ohio Company of Associates promised 100 acres of land to settlers who could prove they were permanent residents. To do that, homesteaders needed to plant 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees within 3 years. Apple trees grew faster than many other fruit trees, making them the perfect proof of permanence. Chapman recognized this opportunity. Living a nomadic life, he moved ahead of settlers, planting orchards before anyone arrived, ensuring that when people came west, they'd need what he already had waiting. All over the West, he planted orchards and then sold them to settlers. Those settlers could point to the trees and say, "This is my orchard, I live here." At the turn of the 19th century, John Chapman headed west, traveling largely by river in canoes. He covered huge stretches of Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and Indiana. He was an unusual figure. He carried very little with him, just a few tools and bags of apple seeds, which he collected from cider mills. Poems and folk stories often describe Johnny Appleseed as a carefree wanderer, happily tossing seeds wherever he went simply because he loved apples and nature. But in reality, he was far more methodical. He carefully fenced off land with fallen logs, planted his trees deliberately, and kept track of every orchard he created. He would return regularly to tend the saplings until they were ready to be sold to pioneers. Wow, yeah. And this ties into something we've been talking about, how hard apple cider, beer, and alcohol in general played a huge role in colonial America. It was just as important during westward expansion because water often wasn't safe to drink. So pioneers relied heavily on hard apple cider.
Right, the same reason people drank so much beer and wine.
Exactly. There's a book, I'm blanking on the author, but it's called Drunk, A History of Alcohol. The author makes a really interesting point. People weren't necessarily drinking because they loved getting drunk. They drank alcohol because it was safer. If people had discovered that drinking water stored in a barrel of rotten fish wouldn't make them sick, they would have done that instead. Alcohol just happened to be cleaner, and it made you feel pretty good. So apples were important for more than one reason. As Johnny Appleseed traveled, planting and tending his orchards, he developed a reputation among the people he met. According to some reports, he sometimes wore nothing more than a coffee sack for clothing. Others claimed he wore a cooking pot on his head, an image that appears in rhymes and stories, though that's probably exaggerated since it would have been heavy and impractical. He also followed a religious movement called the Swedenborgian Church, founded by a man who believed angels delivered secret messages from God. Johnny Appleseed embraced these beliefs. As he traveled, he carried pieces of Swedenborgian theological writings and gave them away to people he met. Some accounts even claim he kept these writings in his hat. Whether or not that hat was ever a cooking pot is debatable. He was deeply opposed to violence toward people, animals, and even trees. He practiced lifelong abstinence, never married, and believed he would be rewarded in heaven for it. And for decades, he simply wandered the frontier, planting apple orchards. By the end of his life, he didn't exactly own vast amounts of land, but he oversaw and controlled roughly 1,200 acres of apple orchards. Wow, yeah, he walked almost everywhere his entire life. In March of 1845, when he was around 70 years old, Johnny Appleseed arrived at a friend's house after walking about 15 miles that day. At first, everything seemed fine. He stayed the night, traded stories, and read from the Bible. But the next morning, he developed a fever and died shortly afterward. At the time, the cause of death was called winter plague, though it was almost certainly pneumonia. Newspapers mourned his passing. One wrote that he was believed to have owned considerable property, yet denied himself even the common necessities of life. It's fascinating to think about. If Johnny Appleseed had written about his travels, he might have produced a work more authentically rooted in nature than Walden, even more so than Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau famously exaggerated his self-sufficiency. His mother reportedly brought him cooked meals while he lived in the wilderness. Johnny Appleseed, by contrast, really did live that life. The folk legends may make him seem like a goofy, seed-throwing drifter, but the truth isn't that far off. He did live simply. He did wander. He did plant apples everywhere he went. The difference is that beneath the myth, there was a businessman, someone who understood land, migration, and opportunity, and built an entire life around it. Right, he clearly had a strategy, but at the same time, he seemed genuinely comfortable living in the woods with very little. I mean, he definitely could have afforded better clothing if he wanted to. Probably, but his beliefs played a big role too, never marrying, remaining abstinent, following the Swedenborgian faith. He was very much doing his own thing. Material comforts just didn't matter to him the way they did to other people.
Yeah, I guess the sad part of the story is that even though he spent his entire life planting apple trees, most of them were eventually destroyed during Prohibition. Federal agents came through and chopped them down because they were worried the apples would be turned into hard cider. So most of them are gone today. I know, Prohibition might be one of the biggest mistakes in American history.
It's wild to think about. Nothing good came from it. It contributed heavily to the rise of organized crime, and people kept drinking anyway.
Yeah, even the president was drinking.
Oh, absolutely. Anti-prohibition politicians would throw parties and openly serve alcohol. And then you see things like this, Johnny Appleseed's trees being destroyed, trees that were over 100 years old and part of American heritage. It almost feels anti-patriotic. Yeah, it really does, especially when you think about how deeply Johnny Appleseed is woven into American culture. There was a Disney movie about him. He's part of the national mythology.
As American as apple pie.
Exactly. In any case, even though his trees were destroyed, Johnny Appleseed himself became an American folk hero. There are poems, songs, and stories about him, and his legacy lives on, even if his apples don't.
Yeah, good for him. If there is a heaven, I hope he was rewarded for the life he lived.
I'm also glad this wasn't one of those deep dives where we discover some horrifying hidden truth.
Right, like Johnny Appleseed was actually a serial killer. Or Johnny Appleseed was Jack the Ripper. No.